Now, let's get to the etiquette of visiting the graves. The very beginning of the series was an incident with Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah ta'ala. And Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah being asked by someone who comes into the city, Ayn al-Umran. And I wanted to start from that premise, where are the living? Where are the living? So imagine someone just came to Dallas and they showed up in not Valley Ranch, but they showed up in a place of Dallas where it's completely dead. Let's say Josephine, Texas. No, I'm just messing around. But take a place where no one's there right now, it's just land, okay? And they said, hey, where do I go? This is before the era of GPSs, and they said, where do I go to find the living? Where are the living at? Where are the city centers at? So Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah is essentially serving that role, subhanAllah. He's out contemplating upon Allah Azza wa Jal. He's one of the great scholars and sages of our Islamic history. And so he takes him to the graveyard, right? And this is where the story starts, and this is where the premise of the series starts. And the man is looking at him like, I asked you to take me to Al-Umran. I'm thinking, where the shopping centers are, where the people are all living. You pulled me out in the middle of nowhere to a cemetery. And he said, people, when they come here, they don't leave. So Al-Umran means the settlements. They settle here. Everywhere else people go, they eventually leave it. So he said, that's why I took you to this place. SubhanAllah, there's another incident from Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala, which I'd like to set for the premise of how we deal with the graves. Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala was missing one day, and his students were looking for him, and they found him after a while. And they said, where were you? Rahimakallah, we were worried about you. And he said, كنت اليوم عند إخوان لي إن نسيت ذكروني وإن غبت عنهم لم يغتابوني. He said, I went to visit some brothers of mine today. When I am forgetful, they remind me. They remind me of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when I am not in their presence, لم يغتابوني, they don't backbite me. They don't speak ill of me. So his students said to him, these are amazing friends, right? That sounds like the exact friend that you want. Someone that reminds you of Allah and that doesn't speak ill of you when you're not around them. So they said, can you take us to them? And he responded and he said, I'm talking about Ahl al-Qubur. I'm talking about the people of the graves. That subhanAllah, when you visit the people of the graves, in nasitu, dhakkaruni. When I become forgetful, they remind me of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِنْ غِبْتُ عَنْهُمْ لَمْ يَغْتَابُونِ. And when I leave them, they don't backbite me. And one of the things, subhanAllah, that he was trying to set with his students is one of the most important practices to keep yourself grounded, which is ziyaratul qubur, to visit the graveyards and to reflect upon the state of the graves. And I want you to think about when you sit with, Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah was talking about where is Al-Umran, where is the place where people are actually alive. Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala was talking about where the living people were. I want you to think about what Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah ta'ala was talking about in terms of the place where people are living. But there's another thing here where you're sitting with people who damage your heart. You're sitting with people who live and who speak and who seem to be alive, but they damage your heart, right? Are you really with the living then, or are they killing you? So the opposite side of that is that you are sitting with those who are actually alive and who bring life to the heart. Those that have passed on to the next life are the ones that are actually living. And they have a much greater effect on giving life to the heart than sitting with the living who backbite, who gossip, who talk about nonsense, who tear into people's honor and dignity and things of that sort. So it's actually a powerful shift that the Salaf, that the pious predecessors, they looked at those who had passed before them to still be very much so a part of their lives. Whether they were their family members or not, they're still very much so a part of their lives. And it's important to think about the perspective. And everything that you try to derive from the company of people, what the company of the dead will actually do for the heart, to give life to the heart. And so this is where we find the encouragement, ziyarat al-qubur, to visit the graves. So we go through a few ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ about what the purpose is of visiting the graves and what benefits exist from visiting al-qubur. The first hadith is from Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زوروا القبور فإنها تذكر الموت. He said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, visit the graves because verily it reminds you of death. In another hadith, which is from Burayda radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنِّي كُنْتُ نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ فَقَدْ أُذِنَ لِمُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ فِي زِيَارَةِ قَبْرِ أُمِّهِ فَزُورُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُ الْآخِرَةِ. The Prophet ﷺ said, I used to forbid you from visiting the graves. But Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was given permission to visit the grave of his mother. So visit it because verily it reminds you of the hereafter. What you'll notice about these ahadith is that the primary purpose for the Prophet ﷺ telling us to go visit the graves is for us to be reminded that the number one takeaway from visiting al-qubur is that you walk away and you are more reminded of the hereafter, because the things that you can do that are of benefit to those that have passed away are not determined by proximity. Meaning what? If you make dua for your deceased relative from your home, or you make dua for your deceased relative standing next to their grave, it's the same effect. If you give sadaqah on behalf of your deceased relative from the graveyard or from your home, it's the same effect. If you pass on some knowledge from your deceased relative next to them or away from them, it has the exact same impact. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying it reminds you of the Akhirah. It reminds you of the hereafter, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the permission to do so. Now, subhanAllah, with that is an important benefit. What reminds you of the hereafter, and what is the reminder of the hereafter supposed to do to you? What's it supposed to provoke in you? If you took the general mentions in the Quran of the reminders of the Akhirah, the reminders of the hereafter are supposed to get you to start praying Qiyamul Layl. The reminders of the hereafter are supposed to get you to start giving out of your wealth, because you feel a sense of urgency when you're reminded of the hereafter. And so you find the famous incident of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he would visit the graves, he would cry so much until his beard would become wet. His beard would become soaked with tears. And they said to him, Ya Uthman, you hear about al-Jannah wal-Nar. You hear about paradise and the fire. It doesn't do to you what this does to you. We don't see you cry this way. And he said, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that this is the first manzil, the first statement of manazil al-akhirah, of the stations of the hereafter. Important lesson means that when you have entered into the barzakh, you're actually in your akhirah now. This is part of your akhirah now. And there are multiple evidences of that. I'll paraphrase many evidences throughout this talk, but the most famous one is when the Prophet ﷺ said to the man who said to him, Mata sa'a, when is the day of judgment? He pointed to a young child, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, by the time this child has gray hair, you would have already met your sa'a, you would have already met your hour, you would have already met your qiyamah. So the barzakh is part of the akhirah for the person that's entered into it. It's there. So he's saying it's the first station of the stations of the hereafter. If it is good, then everything else is good. If it is bad, then everything else will be bad. SubhanAllah, his grandson, you think about the urgency of what the grave is supposed to provoke. Uthman radiallahu anhu had a son named Aban ibn Uthman. He was one of the fuqaha of Medina. He was one of the jurists of Medina. Extremely knowledgeable scholar and a tabi'i, radiallahu ta'ala anhu wa an abi. Aban had a son named Abdurrahman. So Abdurrahman ibn Aban ibn Uthman, who inherited knowledge and wealth, they said. So from Uthman radiallahu anhu, you had multiple qualities. So the ilm, the knowledge, the taqwa, the wealth. And Abdurrahman ibn Aban, when he used to go to the graveyard, like his grandfather, and remember death, subhanAllah, I just want you to think about the sight. When he would come out of the cemetery, like the word would spread amongst the poor people and amongst those who were enslaved that Abdurrahman is visiting the graves right now. Why? Because as soon as he leaves the graveyard, he starts to free people from slavery. And he says, oh Allah, just as I freed this person from captivity, free me from the captivity of hellfire, free me from the punishment. And then he starts to give sadaqah to those that are poor. He starts to give charity to those that are poor. And this is the practice of many of the Salaf, by the way, many of the pious predecessors, that as soon as they would leave the graveyard, they'd immediately spend and they'd give to the poor. So the reminder of the hereafter is supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this world. It's supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this life. And there was a practical, manifest benefit that you would see based on what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned as the primary purpose for going to visit the graveyard, is that it reminds you of the hereafter. Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ said, Inni kuntu nahaytukum, I used to forbid you. How long was the prohibition in place, and what did the prohibition entail? The prohibition was in place up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's mission. Very interesting. Which means that up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's life, you only went to the graveyard for the janazah. You only went to bury and then you left. Okay, there was no concept of ziyarat al-qubur outside of that, of visiting the graves outside of that. Why? Why do you think that is? Why would there be a prohibition of something so good? To avoid shirk. To be specific, these are people that are coming out of idol worship. Right? They're coming out of idol worship. And the place where you could immediately dip right back into some of those things that you have left off is the graveyard. And so there is a solidification of tawheed, a solidifying of tawheed that has to happen, of monotheism that has to happen, and the rulings of Islam being firmed in the hearts of the people and in their practices so that they don't start to mix up these concepts because they're fresh in Islam. They're still fresh in Islam. So the ulama mentioned in the sharh of this hadith that when people are hadithan fil Islam, they're new in Islam, they still need time to sort these things out. And the graveyard is a place where your emotions get the best of you. It's a place where there are indeed so many things that are happening, right, around you. There's adhab here, there's na'im here, there's punishment here, there's reward here. There's so many things happening. And we can see that a person can get truly lost if they don't have a solid understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that fear was subsided by that point. That's number one. Therefore, the benefit of being reminded of the Akhirah overtakes now the fear of the potential falling into practices that are contrary to Islam. What that means is that if you're in a situation where the practices could actually become contrary to the benefit, the reminder the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning, then a person should be careful. Right? That this is for someone that really understands Islam, understands the nature of monotheism, understands that those that have passed do not benefit you. In fact, you are the one that can benefit them with your dua and things of that sort. And they don't get, tangled into some of these concepts. So that's the first thing. The prohibition was removed.